Hello, fellow readers. I'm the Bristly Bear, and today I want to talk to you about horror. Most specifically, fantasy genre horror. I absolutely love some of the older fantasy horror books that I've read. And when I say fantasy horror, I don't necessarily mean swords and sorcery horror, but simply fantasy stories, I believe, that fall into more of the horror genre. There are a few that I grew up with that I don't hear mentioned a lot in current best of lists. And I think largely that might be because they're not as heavily promoted by book-selling sites, and in some cases may not necessarily be printed very often anymore. However, that doesn't mean that they're not available. It just means that it might take a little more effort to find them. And here are a few of the fantasy horror books that I have read and reread over and over. I've loaned them to people and they have just adored them. And I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to read and enjoy them as well. So with that in mind, here are a few forgotten fantasy horror books. The first book that I want to discuss with you is called The Talisman, written in 1985 by Stephen King and Peter Straub. Now, I have read this book numerous times, and I'm in the understanding that they are going to be producing either a TV show or a movie based on this, and if they do, I just simply cannot wait, because this is such an enjoyable read. It features a young boy, 10 years old, named Jack, who lives in our modern day Earth. His mother, unfortunately, is dying of cancer, and their affairs are being handled by his Uncle Morgan, who he very much distrusts. Now, Jack one day finds an old closed seaside carnival, and when he speaks to the caretaker there, the caretaker explains to him that there is a magical talisman that can cure his mother. And that talisman is on the other side of the United States on the West Coast. Now, in order to get it, he provides Jack a magical potion which allows him to leave our Earth and go to an alternate Earth. This alternate Earth has what they call twinners, which are alternate versions of everybody on our Earth. However, it's much more fantasy-like than ours is, and unfortunately is beginning to be ruled over by the twinner of his uncle, who is slowly turning it into a very nightmarish version of our world. Now, Jack must travel from the east coast of the United States to the west coast, and he shuttles back and forth between our Earth and this alternate nightmare Earth, having very, very harrowing experiences on either side of the wall. And he is joined by a couple of interesting characters. The son of his uncle, his cousin, of course, who used to be his best friend and is possibly going to still be his best friend, but it would mean going against his father. And also one of the absolutely most enjoyable and endearing characters that I have ever read in any book, which is a young shepherd who is also a werewolf. And this kind of simple boy named Wolf travels with him through the majority of his journey and is just a delight of a character to get to know. So I would say if you've not had the opportunity to read this book, join Jack on his journey across the United States, traveling in two different worlds and having just the most nightmarish of encounters along his way while he tries to save his mother. And that book is The Talisman by Stephen King and Peter Straub. The next book that I want to discuss with you is actually part of a series, and I highly recommend reading the entire series, but I especially want to tell you about the first book and get you started if you're interested in this world. Now, this book is called Necroscope, and it's written by Brian Lumley in 1986. Now, it features a British man on our Earth who, when he was very young, found out that he had the ability to speak with anyone who has ever died. As long as he can find either where they're buried or where they actually died, he can strike up a conversation with them now. His name is Harry Keogh, and he was very much an outcast when he was a young boy. He was considered very weird and strange. And as you can imagine, for someone that spent most of his time in graveyards just chatting with people, that would be the reaction that most of his peers would have. So once he's grown up, he begins to use his talent to become extremely rich, for he has found that the dead, since they've died, have had nothing better to do than continue the pursuits that they enjoyed when they were alive. So, for instance, architects have been doing nothing except imagining new buildings that they could build, and writers have been writing new work. Poets have been creating new poetry, and songwriters have been creating new songs, you understand. So now Harry can get these ideas from them, learn from them, and actually present all of these works as his own, and quickly becomes an extremely rich person doing so. He finds his mother's grave, and when he does, he finds out that she was actually murdered, and she was murdered by his stepfather. And so he plans to take revenge on his stepfather for this. So his mother actually assists him in all of the steps that he takes to go after his stepfather. And in doing so, he comes under the interest of a branch of the British government that deals specifically with people that have extrasensory abilities like Harry's. And they decide they want to recruit him because they have been fighting a creature from a different universe that is slowly insinuating itself into ours and trying to take over. And this creature, in fact, this entire world that these creatures come from is inhabited almost exclusively by these vampiric creatures that can come over and take over someone else's body and become them. And so they very much need Harry's abilities so that they can fend off this creature. And let me tell you, the abilities that he gets speaking to people as old as Mobius, the philosopher, that have been dead hundreds and hundreds of years, become extremely interesting. So I would say that this is much more of a horror book than my previous ones that I discussed. But if you enjoy something and that sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend that you give this series a try. And that's Necroscope by Brian Lumley. Okay, the next book I have for you is part of a series involving a character named Repairman Jack. And Repairman Jack is one of those characters that is quote-unquote off the grid, someone who doesn't have a social security number or a driver's license, or I apologize for that, or any kind of legal presence whatsoever. And he is someone that, as a repairman, fixes things. In other words, situations that you might have that cannot be handled through normal channels. So think of something like The Equalizer, if you're familiar with that show. However, Repairman Jack's cases often involve something of a supernatural element. Not always, but very, very commonly. And the first book in the Repairman Jack series is called The Tomb. And in this book, he is tasked to find a very old, antique, very expensive necklace for a group of people from East India that are visiting where he lives in New York. And this necklace has been stolen, and he is tasked to get it back. But in doing so, finds himself embroiled in a plot that involves some East Indian folklore. And in fact, at some point, he is attacked by a creature that they call a Rakashi. And this Rakashi is sort of a darkness elemental. And in fact, it most reminded me of one of these, if those of you who are viewing this are players of World of Warcraft might recognize. So these Rakashi are being sent to harry him and prevent his accomplishing this task. And at some point, it involves his ex-girlfriend, who he very much spends time with still, and her daughter, who ends up getting kidnapped by these Rakashi. So it becomes very personal for him. Now, there are a number of Repairman Jack books, and they end up being part of something called the Adversary Cycle that is written by F. Paul Wilson. Now, this Adversary Cycle is not necessary to read to enjoy the Repairman Jack novels. However, they have a very interesting history. If you have ever seen or are familiar with an old 80s horror movie called The Keep, it is actually the first story in the Adversary Cycle written by F. Paul Wilson. And that involves something that happens during World War II with the Nazis occupying a castle-like keep and finding out that it's actually a prison for an evil entity that they end up having to contend with. So, not necessarily a very good movie, but an interesting one to watch if you want to go back for the nostalgia of the Adversary Cycle. And then the Adversary Cycle goes on to a final book called The Night World, which is also the last book in the Repairman Jack series. If you want to read something on a broader scope in this horror genre, then you might really enjoy reading the entire Adversary Cycle. But I definitely suggest you start with The Tomb, which is the first of the Repairman Jack stories, and it was written in 1984. Okay, with that, I'm afraid we have finished the books that I have to present to you today. I hope that I have given you some inspiration to find these books and try reading them. I think you would very much enjoy them. And if you have any books along these lines to suggest, please put it in the comments for my sake or the sake of other watchers of this video so that we might have something new to try as well. And as always, I would appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. I am fairly new to this channel, and I don't have a lot of subscribers, so anyone subscribing is very much appreciated. So thank you, and have a wonderful day. What are you doing, you silly? You're so silly. You're so silly.